The Russian military is not prepared to be on a nuclear battlefield. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the protective gear, they don't want to suffer any repercussions of any kind of retaliation by other countries against them for using a nuclear weapon. So I don't think the Russian military is really up for it. And Putin can't afford to risk giving an order that the Russian military doesn't follow. There are two different things that we're talking about now. One of them is their non adherence to the New START treaty, which is actually not new because they've been violating that treaty anyway. So he's just saying it publicly. The other thing is the possibility of a nuclear use, that they might actually decide to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There is a risk of that. I think it's a low risk. And the reason I think it's a low risk is that it doesn't achieve any goals for Russia. If you use a nuclear weapon, means the territory where you use it becomes uninhabitable. It doesn't actually help you take and hold territory, which is what their objectives actually are. And in addition to that, the Russian military is not prepared to be on a nuclear battlefield. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the protective gear, they don't want to suffer any repercussions of any kind of retaliation by other countries against them for using a nuclear weapon. So I don't think the Russian military is really up for it. And Putin can't afford to risk giving an order that the Russian military doesn't follow.
Do you share the view that the window of opportunity to get out of this war for Ukraine, to drive Russia out of Ukraine, is this year? That actually, particularly if we regard the nuclear threat as low, it is beholden upon all of the West to give as much armament to the Ukraine as possible in order that Ukraine can have a very, very successful counteroffensive over the course of the spring and summer and kick Russia out. Because if they don't, this is Vietnam. This is a long, long, long war of attrition. And those sorts of wars, Russia are very good at because they don't care about human life, not least their own.
I do think that time is of the essence. We should be giving Ukraine the equipment that they need now. And that's because it's going to create less suffering for Ukrainians, less loss of life, and frankly, less disruption to the whole world the sooner this gets over. But the flip side of that is if they don't do it this year, I'm not sure that it is just, a hopeless circumstance and a war that just goes on forever, because the Ukrainians are not going to give up. If they don't push the Russians out this year in 2023, they're going to push them out next year. And if they don't get it next year, they'll do it the year after that. That this is their home, this is their land, these are their families, these are their people. They're just not going to give up on pushing the Russians out of their homeland.
Do you think that means, in practice, the US and the UK and other NATO countries, would you be calling for this if you had your old job, effectively, that we need to be on war footing? We need to be making sure that our munitions industries are churning out lots of ammunition. We are supplying all the way up to fighter jets, if possible, things that can actually shift the war. Do we need to move the US and the UK, for example, to this war footing when it comes to the provision of armament?
Yeah, we should. And, it's not that long ago, I guess it's 3 years ago, that we commandeered US industry in order to make ventilators because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We used the Defense Act that existed on the books since World War II times. And yet we're not doing that sort of thing today to actually increase our production of military armaments so that we have enough ammunition for ourselves and for Ukraine. We ought to be thinking about that sort of thing right now.
Would you draw a link between the two, actually? A pandemic, a crisis that was faced 3 years ago. There was an immediate industrial response. This is a crisis that we're all facing. There should be an industrial response in return.
I think there should be, because we can see the impact of our not doing it, that we are now producing less ammunition per month than the Ukrainians are using per month by a long shot. So this can't continue this way. Ukrainians are losing lives at a heavy rate. Not as many as the Russians, but the Russians have a lot more to throw at it. So we have to do something to change the dynamic. And what would change the dynamic is better equipment in the Ukrainians' hands more quickly, because it is the quality of their effort that's actually going to win the war. They're not going to win on quantity. The Russians have that. But they are going to win on the quality of what they do. And the sooner the better.
Would that go so far as to go to fighter jets and the training for the fighter jets, get it done?
Yeah, well, this is something, that we were talking about this, if you remember, a year ago when President Biden was in Warsaw in March of 22. There was talk about getting fighter jets to the Ukrainians. We're talking about MiG-29s at the time rather than F-16s. And it looked as though it was going to happen, and then it was stopped at the last minute and saying, no, we're not going to do that. But that was the time to then say, okay, well, let's start training the Ukrainians so that they would be capable of getting F-16s and employing them as soon as possible. We've lost a year on that. But even so, every journey starts with one step. We should start with training right now and see how quickly we can actually get crews trained on maintenance, on logistics, on flying the planes, and then getting the planes there themselves so that maybe several months from now, it may still be, but we can actually get them there. And if we don't start that today, every day we don't, we're pushing it off into the future.
So just finally, why has there been this sort of strange Janus facing on this? Because at one level, the UK's led the way to a certain extent, very keen to arm Ukraine. The US has been pretty positive on it. Germany has ummed and ahed quite a lot. France has had its moments of being positive. And yet we still feel that we've not quite gone all in. Why is that? Is that because there's political opposition, because there's monetary opposition, because there is this nuclear threat that's in everyone's minds? It seems that we're trying to be half pregnant here. And why is that?
That's right. There is a deliberate policy of incrementalism, of not doing everything that we can. And it is, as I understand it, to avoid risking Russian escalation against NATO countries or into a nuclear space. And so by doing enough to help Ukraine, but not going too far, our leaders are thinking that they are somehow managing this escalation risk. I personally don't agree with that. I think that that is overestimating the importance of what we're doing. Russia is already throwing everything it can at this war. They can't do much more than what they're doing right now. And they already assume that we are already in the war ourselves. So doing more is not going to change their calculus. They're already there. So what we're doing through this incrementalism is actually prolonging the war and causing more suffering.